This is Katrin with Disability Rights New York. Welcome to our podcast, Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned. We are here to bring you information on the most relevant topics regarding disability rights and advocacy. Today, we welcome DRNY Pair and PAIMI Director Marc Fliedner. He's here to discuss an upcoming event. It's a virtual roundtable, and it's to present a joint report called Systems in Crisis, Identifying Critical Issues in Response to Mental Health Crisis Calls. Marc, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, great to be with you as always.
So, Marc, let's first talk about, we have a great event coming, but let's talk about the project itself first, because we didn't do this alone. Who else was involved in this project?
Yeah, that's right. It was about 6 months ago now that we all saw the Daniel Prude video, how Mr. Prude was killed at the hands of police officers in Rochester after his brother had reached out to 911 to seek assistance for his brother who was in a state of mental health crisis. And it really compelled us as an organization, Disability Rights New York, but also particularly my program, Protection and Advocacy for Individuals with Mental Illness, to look at this issue of why do these tragedies keep happening and how can we do better? What's the right model to address mental health crisis calls when folks want to call to get help, not put their loved ones in harm's way? So we realized that we wanted to move as quickly as we possibly could to engage in the community and lead the community to a degree in the conversation, but we couldn't do that alone. And so we reached out, the PAMI program reached out to John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I had some colleagues that I'd worked with there before who are clinical psych grad school directors, and they reached out to their students and said, yeah, we'd love to look at this topic with you. They came at it from a couple of specific lenses. One was looking at folks with mental illness and their interactions with police over the decades. And also, the other program wanted to look at the intersection with BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, the intersection with mental health and the interactions with the police that have unfortunately so often resulted in tragedy and other kinds of harm. So it became this great dynamic partnership with these two clinical psych programs of John Jay.
And it's important for us to point out that there were two labs that were involved in this project at John Jay, were the Mental Health Recovery Research and Nadal Racial Justice Research Labs. Those are the two groups that we were working with, and they will also have representation at this roundtable on April 7th. So we talked a little bit about the significance, the timing of this report. Let's talk about why we wanted to have it published specifically on the day that we did, which was March 25th. What was happening that week?
Well, not only was it at about the 6 month mark from when we as a state, a nation, and certainly every community in this state learned of what had happened to Daniel Prude and got the conversation going, but there were a lot of things happening and are still a lot of things happening in this very moment. We have communities that have been asked by the state, by the governor's office, to provide them with blueprints that they have developed for changing their response, including looking at the appropriateness of police response in these matters by April 1st. And a lot of communities have been struggling to meet the deadline, frankly, and are hoping that there's some latitude in being able to continue the conversation and further develop their models post April 1st. And it also has been critical because for that entire time, as we speak, there are communities all over the state of New York and certainly all over the nation that are looking at this issue, fueled by the racial justice movement that started when George Floyd was killed, continued with a conversation that's been happening really for decades in New York State about how mental illness and those who are trying to get assistance for their loved ones and neighbors and themselves are sometimes put in harm's way by certain responses.
And certainly, we're talking about New York State because that's where we're located. However, this report has national implications as well. I believe that the information within it, specifically looking at communities to really work within themselves to figure out what's best. This is not a one size fits all. This is not something that says that there's the cookie cutter plan that each community should have. Let's talk about why this report is so important, specifically to communities and how they need to interact together in order to come up with a plan that is specific and will work for them.
Well, thank you for several things you pointed out, Katrin, and that's absolutely correct. There are some sound models. There have been crisis response teams in place for many years throughout the state and the nation. Most of them include police, but there are some models now, the sort of like gold standard, if you will, being known as the Cahoots model out of Oregon. But every community is different. Every community is different by virtue of its breadth, by virtue of the amount and the real breadth of mental health systems that they have in place at the local level, and also the community positions on who should be the members of these teams. Should they be made up of peer counselors? Should they be made up of clinicians who've worked with folks in mental health crisis before? Should they be made up of emergency services folks? And then probably as importantly as anything about this conversation is what training will be initiated and kept in place during the whole time that these teams are operating. Because unfortunately, we've learned that police officers who are trained specifically working with folks who are in mental health crisis do not necessarily find themselves using less force or less restraint than they were as an entity before. And that's troubling. Part of what our partners and I realized, and it's in part because of the disciplines in which they work, is that the training hasn't included a recognition of the intersection between folks with mental illness and other traditionally disenfranchised communities that tend to be very heavily policed, and communities that unfortunately for historical reasons, and then we turn back to George Floyd, where the interaction between police and folks of color, and certainly folks with mental illness, has so often been combative, not really constructive, and also informed by some stigma in the community overall, but also stigma in the police culture about people with mental illness.
And so we're going to have this virtual roundtable tonight. It's April 7th. It will be at 6:30 until 8 o'clock tonight. We have some great panelists that are coming to the table, and we're going to have a good discussion. Certainly, we could talk on this podcast for hours today about this report. There's so much information that is not just valuable in an academic sense, but with real life applications for all communities. And let's talk about who's going to be on the panel. And also, there are some guiding principles in this report. We should bring that up. So before we talk about who's on the panel, let's talk about these guiding principles. We don't have to go through all of them, but just let us know what they are, and we'll have them available tonight for people to take a look at. And so let's talk about why we did that.
Well, we have a literature review that's got some academic information and reports that show from a data perspective how the interactions between police and those with mental illness have taken place over the years, the history of how they've unfolded. But we wanted to have a sort of a living document that would help folks with sort of a blueprint for how to go about looking at the model that's right for their community. One of the key guiding principles is don't try to adopt something else and take it just as it is, because it's just not going to work. Another key principle is that you have to engage all of the people that have a stake in what is going to change about the system with these new models. And that does include law enforcement. It includes certainly mental health professionals. It includes, first and foremost, people with mental illness and their families and their loved ones who have these lived experiences with trauma and trauma where police have been called in to respond. So the stakeholder buy-in is a critical piece, not only because it makes good sense, obviously it's the logical place to start, but if some policymaker is inclined to sort of want to put it out there and put their stamp on it quickly without engaging stakeholders whose work days will be dramatically impacted by whether they're parts of this team or not, or people with mental illness who will be dramatically impacted by how that call goes when somebody's seeking assistance for them, it's going to fail. Because they're going to realize that they didn't have an appropriate seat at the table, that they were not properly consulted, and there are unfortunate spots that we're missing in terms of the analysis of what model is going to work. So those are just a few of the key principles. We love to focus on the fact that it should be localized mental health response as much as possible, because studies and lived experience show that where mental health professionals at the local level have some familiarity, not only with the neighborhood culture, but sometimes with the individuals who might be the subject of the call, that things are much more constructive, that de-escalation of the trauma can be much more effective. And even if communities were to use it as a checklist, we'd be not only grateful, but frankly honored. We just wanted to play a leadership role on a topic that's so important at the intersection of law and mental health, which is where our organization falls, and particularly where the PAIMI program falls.
That's great. And I can't wait to hear more about this tonight. And so let's talk about this panel. It's pretty impressive. We have our executive director, Tim Clune, and Phil Llanos, who is a professor at one of the labs at John Jay. They'll kick off the event, but let's talk about who else is on the panel tonight.
Thrilled that our executive director, Tim, and Phil Llanos are going to lead it off, because Phil Llanos and his colleague, Kevin Nadal, prepared an op-ed that actually ended up in Psychology Today, talking about the importance of the report and the importance of the conversation. So Kevin Nadal, that I just mentioned, is Dr. Nadal is going to be one of the members of the panel. I'm honored that I will be, along with my colleague here at DRNY, Erica Molina, who is the chair of our Racial Justice Task Force. And it'll be moderated by Jeff Coots, who is a John Jay person who really focuses on policing and its impact on the culture. So he's a logical person to moderate and ask the questions that are on his mind. And then Therese Todd, and I hope it's Rukia King. I haven't had the pleasure of meeting Ms. King yet, but I'm looking forward to it. I haven't met some of these folks because they were doing their work at John Jay parallel with the work we were doing at PAIMI, but I'm really looking forward to not only having a conversation with them about this topic, but actually connecting with them as professionals, because we'll have more work to do together in the future.
Well, we'll also have this event closed captioned, and Donna Jean Steele, who is our in-house ASL interpreter, she will be there as well. We do have this event on Facebook, so if you need information for the link, it's there, and we will also put it in the description of this podcast. So if you are looking for how to get to the event tonight, it is April 7th from 6:30 p.m. until 8 p.m. It is a virtual roundtable. So certainly you can find that information there. And Marc, is there anything else you want to let our audience know about the event tonight?
Just that I'm hopeful that it will start a conversation not only at their kitchen tables and their living rooms, but with their other community stakeholders, and that we may be able to assist and frankly, as communities look at this issue and are looking at the model that's right for them, we're hoping they consider DRNY and John Jay College of Criminal Justice to be resources going forward.
That's great. And Marc, thank you so much for your time today. I'm really looking forward to the event tonight.
Well, thanks. Me too.
Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned has been brought to you by Disability Rights New York, your source for disability rights and advocacy. If you enjoyed our program, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this post. If there is a subject you would like us to discuss, please email podcast@drny.org or comment below. Tune in next Wednesday, where we'll bring you more information on disability rights in the state of New York. The closed captioned and ASL version of this podcast is available on our YouTube channel. To listen to more Empire State of Rights closed captioned, follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.